This is a presentation on wage differentials, and this first picture is taken from the Guardian newspaper, and we've got some really interesting statistics here about the difference in pay between men and women, and we're going to have a look at the difference in pay between a lot of different groups of people. So these are the specification objectives, and wage differentials occur when labour markets are not perfectly competitive, because remember, when labour markets are perfectly competitive, all occupations theoretically should be paid the same amount, but we find that there are differences in wages that occur between different groups of workers and regionally as well, and different industries. So why do we get wage differentials? Well, firstly, there's differences in the amount of demand and supply for certain jobs, and you can analyse that and go back to the demand for labour and the supply of labour presentation. So some jobs need a lot of training, a lot of qualifications. That's going to take time. There's going to be fewer people in the economy with those skills. Some jobs are more in demand than others. Medicine is a really big sector of our economy, because obviously we've got the NHS, but it's also thought of being very, very important. So we do have a lot of demand for medical professionals in our economy. There are differences in bargaining strengths, mainly due to trade union membership, but as well just how confident people feel to be able to bargain with wages. It might be a cultural thing, generational thing sometimes. Government policy can determine differences in wages. So the minimum wage and kind of living wage, the new living wage that's just come in this month, that's going to have an effect on some jobs more than other jobs, but that's certainly going to have differences in terms of how much it kind of costs, or how much costs can increase for firms, and government spending as well, what the government decide to spend their money on in terms of healthcare and education. Remember, labour is derived demand, so if there's more demand for healthcare and education, therefore there'll be more demand for those jobs. Esteem as well can come into bargaining power, but also in terms of how important certain jobs and vocations are in certain cultures as well. So I suppose in our culture we view medical professionals, or certainly I do, as being held in quite high esteem and very important for our economy, very important for our living standards. But we also have a great appreciation in the UK for the arts and the cultural aspect of the country as well. So artists, actors, musicians, whereas in some other country they might not be as highly valued. So we get all these differences in demand and supply, and the factors that are causing demand for the finished outputs and those types of things. So esteem can be analysed in the marginal revenue product, the actual demand for the product, for the amount of labour in the market. We also see, even within the same occupation, so this list here is really why the differences between occupations. But this great list is, well, even when we see people employed in certain occupations, we tend to see differences between groups of people. So skilled and unskilled workers, there tend to be more supply of unskilled workers, so that there might be a larger supply, which we know puts downwards pressure on wages or prices. Male and female workers, I showed you that graph at the beginning. Estimates vary between different countries, but roughly speaking, women get paid about 80% of what your average male person gets paid in this country. So big differences there. The things that can account for this are discrimination in the workplace. People possibly may perceive women as being less productive. That's not true that they're less productive, but there might be some perception that they are. Definitely historically there has been, and women may need to take career breaks for children, child rearing and giving birth, although the government are trying to change policy so that it makes it easier for fathers to take paternity in place of the mother taking maternity, but they might have kind of career breaks, and they miss out on promotional opportunities and training opportunities. More women as well, because more women proportionally do take a greater share of the child rearing duties. More women actually find that works better with part-time work, and we do find that there's a difference in the amount part-time employees and full-time workers are paid. So part-time employees may miss out on promotions, they may miss out on training opportunities, and therefore may be perceived or may actually be less productive. Ethnic origin as well, we see differences in the amounts that ethnic people are paid from different ethnic backgrounds. Again, this might be accounted for due to discrimination, negative discrimination in the workplace. There may be some cultural background to this as well, so certain ethnicities choose to work in certain industries possibly, so you might have like certain ethnic heritage working in an area such as kind of restaurant work, and that might be quite low paid. Another ethnic origin might have a cultural preference for people to go into medicine or law, and that might account for differences between ethnicities. So I've been mentioning positive, I've mentioned negative discrimination. We can actually get positive discrimination as well. And what happens is positive discrimination moves that demand curve to the right, the marginal revenue product. And this is, positive discrimination is where an employer perceives the group of individuals from a certain ethnicity or gender or culture. It could be heritage, it could be anything, or location, or they've gone to a particular university. They perceive them to be more productive, so they're more likely to employ them. There's higher demand for them. And negative discrimination works in the other way, so there's less demand for people from those groups. Now the impact, in the specification there is a section on the conditions necessary to carry out wage discrimination, and this is exactly the same as what we looked at, monopolies and price discrimination, but the conditions necessary is that the employer can actually differentiate between groups of people. So ethnicities is one of the ones that, and gender as well, gender-based discrimination, ethnic-based discrimination, these are two forms of discrimination that are quite prevalent, even though we've got a lot of laws to protect against these types of things. And one of the reasons that I think it's quite prevalent is because it is, generally speaking, quite easy to differentiate between groups of people. Very visually, you can tell if someone's from a certain ethnic heritage, or you can kind of make an approximation. Obviously, people, are all kinds of mixes, all kinds of backgrounds these days, and there's so many different cultures in the world, but visually you can tell the difference between a black woman and a white man. They look different, so this might enable employers to carry out discrimination, whereas if they couldn't see the difference, so for example, your sexual orientation, this is not something that most people really bring up in a work sense, so it's harder, it makes it harder for employers to discriminate based on that, although there have been cases in the news where employers do discriminate, but it makes it harder for them to discriminate because they can't tell the difference between kind of somebody who is straight and someone who's gay necessarily. So they've got to be able to differentiate between the groups, and other employers have to also be discriminating, because if there was only one business in the market kind of discriminating, you just think, well, if you were kind of a group that were being negatively discriminated against, you just think, well, I won't go and work for them. And if it was a perfectly competitive market where they only constituted a really small part of the employers out there, it wouldn't have a major effect on the market. But if it's a monopsonist buyer of labour and they're partaking in discrimination, and you're one of the groups that's being discriminated against, you're going to be really affected by that. and the employer has to kind of feel that they can get away with it. So there's lots of anti-discrimination acts against gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, disability around these days. So to actually partake in kind of wage discrimination, you've got to be relatively confident that you're going to not get taken to the courts, and there's not going to be any kind of proof of it, because it is going to be illegal. But the impact of it is, and historically the impact of it has been that there's lower pay for those groups that are discriminated against. So this has a major impact on their life, their standard of living, and health, often, if they can't access the things that other groups in the economy can access. But for firms as well, it means that they're really cutting down their pool of potential employees. So it's there's fewer workers to choose from. This might mean that they're less productive, less competitive. It might mean that they're higher cost. So they're really shooting themselves in the foot through partaking in negative or any form of discrimination. And the government are going to have to spend on benefits for those people that are discriminated against, because they're more likely to be the unemployed and people that can't find work. So that's an opportunity cost for the government. And then the government or most governments would see this as a really awful thing for employees to be doing. So they're going to be wanting to spend on legislation and policing that legislation. So you might think, well, why do we have this kind of positive discrimination then, if negative discrimination is kind of so awful? And I suppose any positive discrimination just results in negative discrimination against another group. But often the reason that it's justified is where there's been a history of negative discrimination against a particular group. So it often encourages the government encouraging policies of positive discrimination. So in America, you can actually research this. They call it affirmative action. And so historically in America, certainly Black people have been discriminated against, may have found it harder to get jobs, higher paying jobs, and all those types of things. So there are affirmative action, which doesn't just affect Black people, but you can read about, if you Google that, you can read about the pros and cons of that particular action. But in the UK, we've had more kind of positive discrimination. We're trying to get more women into certain professions. So I know a few years ago, certainly in politics, they were trying to get more senior female MPs promoted to kind of cabinet positions. So you could research that, whether that's a good policy or not. It kind of goes beyond the realms of economics, the kind of whether positive discrimination or affirmative action is a good thing. And it's certainly beyond the realms of the A-level specification, but it's a really interesting section to look at. And I would just personally kind of focus on those diagrams there, where it's shifting the demand curve from the actual to the kind of perceived marginal revenue product, whether that's to the right in the case of positive discrimination or to the left in the case of negative discrimination.